Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto reaches his breaking point after being bullied, the world's greatest villain, part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. Was lunchtime and, just like most days, there was a wild commotion going on over at the academy's playground. Gathered around the climbing sets and spider webs, a large group of kids, mostly boys, were currently gathered around their troop leader, who'd just popped the question as to who wanted to have a game of ninjas. Obviously, a majority of them wanted to take part, and so, once a unanimous decision had been made, the youngsters began allocating roles and positions between one another. It was a clumsy start at first, what with them bickering over who wanted to play what ninja. But as soon as all the children knew who they were going to be imitating, they scattered and began to chase each other around the entire yard. For the next several minutes after that, under the careful watch of their teacher Daikoku Funino, the kids ran circles around the entire area. Sprinting across the bark, hopping over various obstacles and playground equipment, and even interrupting a couple of girls building castles in the sand pit, the boys had a ball as they pretended to clash kunai with one another and cast jutsu. Them being so young, of course, neither of them actually knew how to throw any fireballs or earth walls at each other just yet, so they just stuck with the basics of pretend play. Eventually the game reached a point where one of the children, a popular Uchiha boy named Kato, had one of his friends trapped against the rock climbing wall. With the other youngsters back to it, the adolescent prodigy advanced with his sword drawn and ready to strike. Ha ha, surrender. The boy chuckled. The other boy with brown hair grinned back and formed a cross guard with his arms. You can't touch me. Not when I have the first Hokage's Mokuten would release defending me. Kato recoiled at the boy's declaration and glared. Hey, you can't do that. That's cheating. Nah, not it isn't, the other boy stated. It's my super secret, special move. The best there is. No one in this village uses that jutsu anymore. Oh yeah, well, someday I will. I just have to practice. Ha, yeah, right, Kato replied, causing his friend to glower at him while he crossed his arms proudly. If anyone is going to have amazing jutsu when they grow up, it's going to be me. I'll become an even better ninja than Sasuke's mum and dad. Not exactly liking how the most popular boy in their group was taking this, the youngster with spiky brown hair and wearing the yellow t-shirt pouted and stood off of the wall. This is getting boring. It's no fun when we don't have a real bad guy ninja in our group. Everybody here is playing a good guy. He said this while referring to the rest of their gang, who quickly approached the pair when they realized no one was chasing anyone anymore. Yeah, another boy in a white singlet, a buzz cut and a missing tooth spoke up as he looked between his friends. Who can we get to play a bad guy? After looking over his troop for a moment and seeing no one wanted to volunteer, Kato then looked over his shoulder and spotted a lone boy sitting on the swing set nearby all by himself and reading from a book. Being able to spot him due to the fact that nobody was in the same area as him, the young Uchiha with the spiky black hair grinned and nodded over to him. Hey, what about him? When his friends all looked to see who he was referring to, the brown-haired Sarutobi boy who he was playing with before blinked. Isn't he the new kid? The one our parents said not to go near. Naru something. Naruto. Yeah, that's it. Seeing the blonde boy with whiskers in the white shirt and orange shorts swinging back and forth on the seat, and completely engrossed in his picture book, he didn't seem like much at first glance. The fact that he didn't appear dangerous or intimidating in the least made him seem like an easy target to the boys, with Kato giving a wicked smirk as a result and beckoning his friends to follow. Soon the 6 or so boys had crossed the playground and quickly gathered around Naruto, who took a few moments to register to the fact that a couple of kids were in front of him. When he looked up, the blonde blinked when he saw he was surrounded by a group of smiling boys from his class. Yo, Kato greeted with a seemingly friendly wave and a kind grin. Realizing that somebody was actually speaking to him, the previously distracted Naruto replied with a nervous nod. Oh, hi. Do you want to play ninjas with us? Kato asked curiously. You look a little lonely over here. Yeah, join us, another of the boys in the group spoke. It'll be fun. Naruto stuttered, obviously still surprised as his eyes darted between the kids. Eventually, after getting over the fact that he was being asked to join in for the first time, the whiskered youngster then broke out a smile and nodded. Oh, okay. He then closed his book and hopped off the swing, completely heedless of what the boys had in store for him. So, how is this game supposed to be played? As Kato led Naruto across the playground to the climbing set, he and his friends told the blonde what they wanted him to do for them. It's easy. It's like pretend chasey. First we pick a person to play the bad guy ninja, and then the rest of the good guy ninjas have to team up to fight him, with the Hokage in the lead. Naruto, finding the concept behind this game to be quite exciting, gave the Uchiha a cheerful grin. Alright, so, who gets to be what? Can I be Hokage? He asked his question with a hopeful look in his eyes. Oh, we've decided that you'll be playing the bad guy first, Kato replied quickly, holding his hand out and stopping Naruto in the middle of playground area just in front of the spider net. You stand right here, and don't move, okay? This is super important. When he saw the blonde nod in understanding, he and his friends then scattered about the area, with the Uchiha quickly climbing up the spider net to the very top. Once he was positioned on its very peak, he stood up. Alright, the game starts now. Before Naruto could ask what was going to happen or what he was supposed to do, he saw Kato take a stance with his fist waving enthusiastically in the air. Ta-do-do-dum. After a long and tough battle with the enemy shinobi, it is now up to the amazing 5th Hokage to step forward and save the day. Kato Uchiha, the child exclaimed, earning a round of cheers from his friends and drawing the attention of some of the other kids in the area. Naruto meanwhile just stared up at the raven-haired boy as he then pointed down at him. Prepare yourself, villain, for it is time for you to meet your maker. Crouching low, the boy then leapt off of the spider web and dove down at the blonde, grinning wildly. Ninpo. Kyuto kick. Ninja art. Soaring kick. Yelping in alarm, Naruto instinctively leapt to the side, avoiding the boy's kick as he then crashed into the floor with a loud thud. When the cloud of dust settled, it revealed a now grounded Kato sitting on the bark, a dazed look on his face and his shorts covered in dirt. As he sat up, he then gave a pained wince and looked down at his hand. Ouch. When his friends approached, and observing Naruto stepped forward in worry. Sorry. Are you okay, Kato? Did you hurt yourself? Looking up at the blonde, the Uchiha frowned. I skinned my hand. Why did you dodge, you idiot? He then stood up, stumbling slightly due to the rough landing. That's not how the game works. You're supposed to be playing the bad guy. That means you're not allowed to move. Huh, Naruto balked, staring at the now annoyed-looking boy in confusion. I can't move. That doesn't make any sense. Hiko. Yochin. Hold on to him for a second. Kato shouted towards his friends. Okay. The brown-haired Sarutobi responded, at the same time he and a second boy grabbed the blonde youngster's arms from either side and kept him in place. As Naruto looked between the two youngsters in surprise, he then turned to Kato to ask again what he'd done wrong. Surely there wasn't a problem with him moving to avoid another kid crashing into him, was there? Unfortunately he never got a chance to make his inquiry, as the next thing he knew was feeling a heavy weight smash him in the face as the Uchiha raised his foot and kicked him squarely between the eyes. The blonde then dropped to the floor like a sack of flour, landing painfully on his rear and hands. Upon which he then looked up with a start to see Kato standing there and grinning triumphantly. Attack successful. The Uchiha laughed while puffing his chest out arrogantly. Naruto the monster ninja has been crushed. His announcement earned him a round of cheers and laughs from the rest of the children, all of whom obviously found the scene both epic and cool. Blinking in a daze as he stared up at the prodigy and his compatriots, Naruto then felt something wet dribble down his lips and reached up to brush his mouth. He winced as he did so, pulling away to see that he had a bloody nose, which had been broken from the hit. Trembling when he realized he'd been hurt, the blonde then looked up at the kids anxiously. Hey, why did you hit me so hard? By this point Kato and his friends saw what had happened, all of them looking down at the boy in momentary bewilderment. However, just as the children were trying to form some kind of reply, they were interrupted by the arrival of the yard teacher Daikoku, who'd rushed over when he noticed the commotion going on over by the spider web. Hey! When the rotund Chunin with the beard arrived on the scene, he quickly looked from the standing group of boys to the fallen Naruto. Upon which he then placed his hands on his hips and frowned deeply. Can one of you please explain to me what happened over here? The entire playground remained silent, as it was obvious the man was taking this scene very seriously. After Kato and Ko looked between one another in momentary concern, the young Hiko then stepped forward and pointed down at Naruto, who was expecting the boy to clear up the situation and explain that he'd been kicked. However, Naruto tried to jump down from the top of the spider web. But he tripped and hurt himself. The blonde's head snapped towards Hiko in alarm. No, I didn't. The whisker-marked child then looked back at Daikoku. That's not what happened, sensei. Kato kicked me in the face while we were playing ninjas, on purpose. Glancing between the accused and the ones involved in the situation, the Chunin then focused his attention on the Uchiha and gave him a hard look over. Is this true? Pausing for a moment to look at Naruto and then his friends, the Uchiha then put on his best innocent exterior and turned back to the teacher. No, sir. Naruto fell over after he tried to jump and landed on his face. He got embarrassed and started blaming me. Yeah, it's true, another of his friends spoke up in support. That's what happened, sensei. We saw the whole thing. Naruto tripped over while we were playing ninja, came the voices of the rest of his companions, all of whom were quickly aligning themselves in defense of their best friend and leader. That's the truth. While Naruto looked between the boys in disbelief, a keenly listening Daikoku sighed and, reaching over, helped the blonde to his feet. You should really be more careful, Naruto-kun. Don't try to do things that you're not ready for, otherwise you'll end up hurting yourself. Upon setting the boy straight, he then checked the rest of his person for more bleeds. Luckily it was just his nose. Try to keep both feet on the ground from now on, okay? But, the blonde stammered, wanting to mount some sort of a defense to preserve his honor and explain what really happened, but was promptly shut down by the adult. No buts, Daikoku interrupted, pulling a facial tissue out of his pouch and handing it to the child. He then helped the boy bring it up to his nose to stop the hemorrhaging. Now go up to the nurse's office so they can take a closer look at that, and make sure nothing is broken. He then instructed one of the nearby girls to escort the youngster, so that they didn't get lost. And so, unable to get a word in, Naruto begun his walk back to the building. All the while he couldn't help but think to himself what the heck just happened and why things turned out the way they did. Just when he thought he was starting to make friends, it turned out to be something else. A few weeks later, a few days after the incident at the playground, Naruto had chosen to carry on with his schooling as per usual and to not pursue the issue. Figuring he couldn't really do anything about the kicking and convincing himself that the whole thing was just an accident, he elected not to get hung up over the game and instead went on to try and fit in with the rest of his peers. Of course, due to the nature in which everybody was currently treating him, it wasn't exactly an easy endeavor. It hadn't been long since Naruto had embarked upon his foundation year here at the academy, about 2 months at the most. When he started, the blonde figured he was going to be getting a fresh start in life and a clean slate, believing he could actually find some friends here and children he could play with. Thus he entered the school on his first day with a big smile on his face and a spring in his step. But, as he quickly found out after his first week, despite the incredible abundance of new faces and hours of play to be had during the working periods, every time Naruto attempted to approach the kids and ask if he could join in with them, they would either ignore him, tell him to go away, run off, or be dragged away by their teachers, parents, or friends. At first, Naruto figured this was just a passing phase, as at one point he thought he was able to find a fast friendship with the boys Kiba, Shikamaru, and Choji. They were a nice group and, after playing with them on the playground and in class, they'd really hit it off with each other. The three really enjoyed hanging out with the blonde. But almost as soon as after meeting them, Naruto was told that their parents didn't want their kids hanging out with him anymore, and was essentially left out of their group. This not only dampened Naruto's spirits during his free periods, but also made his time at the academy all the more disheartening. And so the blonde resigned himself to carrying on with his time at the academy alone and unnoticed, and for the most part kept to himself. That was until Kato and his band of friends started inviting him into their circle to play more ninja games with them, and, as Naruto was quick to discover, neither one of their games was cordial in the least. Over the next couple of weeks since the first time they asked him to join in, Kato or one of his companions would approach the blonde orphan during free time under the pretext of talking to him or inviting him over for a different game. When Naruto either accepted or declined their request, he was then ambushed by the group of kids, all of whom were acting out the roles of Konoha Ninja, while he was instantly slapped with the title of Enemy Ninja, and was hence set upon by their squad. At first it started out as just good, old-fashioned child's play and teasing, with the kids dropping toys or shuriken-shaped paper on Naruto's head, or splashing him with paint or water, and proclaiming he'd been defeated. But then, after the first dozen or so games, things started to get a little rougher and violent. Soon Naruto was being blindsided by the gang almost every play period, with each time ending with the blonde being outnumbered and ganged up on by the entire group. They even started hitting him from behind with their hands or toys when the teacher wasn't looking or out of the room, before finishing with the orphan somehow winding up on the ground with a new bump or bruise on his person. On one end of the spectrum, Kato and his friends thought this was very funny. On the other end, however, Naruto did not, and after several more days of being pushed around and knocked onto his backside by the gang of mischievous youngsters, the blonde had had enough. A loud clatter rang throughout the classroom as a table was suddenly flipped over. When the children in the room quickly looked across the way, they saw Naruto standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by ruined artwork, glaring across at Kato and his group. The gang of youngsters were surrounding the blonde and looking at him in surprise, while the spiky-haired orphan was seething. "Huh, what's going on?" one of the girls nearby asked. "Why are the boys fighting? Did someone call a teacher?" "Look, Naruto's started a fight." As the rest of the class started to gather around the scene and chatter with interest, Naruto continued to huff and glare across at Kato angrily. Looking at his current state, the children noticed the blonde's shirt was a bit wet and so was the floor. This gave the indication that the boys surrounding his upturned table had once again splashed the kid with a cup of water, which was now lying empty on the floor alongside his ruined painting. This in turn triggered the blonde's anger and prompted him to knock both his chair and table onto their sides, as well as take a swing at the kid who threw the water at him. Though he missed, his actions at the back of the classroom still caused quite a stir. "What happened?" one of the girls asked one of Kato's friends. "We were just playing, but Naruto got mad," Hiko whispered back, finding the blonde's reaction to be quite scary. He stood up and pushed his table over. "Man, what's his problem?" Taking a deep breath, the upset child with whiskers dusted his top and growled. "I can't stand it anymore." He then pointed across at the Uchiha boy and bared his teeth at him. "Kato, I demand a duel." In response, the raven-haired youngster frowned in confusion. "Huh, what are you talking about, Naruto? We were just playing ninjas again." That's the point. The orphan shouted, clenching his fists tightly and focusing his ire on the boys around him. At the same time, he became vaguely aware of the rest of the class gathering around them. I don't want to play the bad guy ninja or the monster ninja anymore. It's not fun. I want to be the Hokage. Fight me, and if I win, promise you won't bother me anymore. At first, no one really said anything, as Kato turned to his friends, who all whispered to each other over what Naruto was carrying on about. Eventually, after several moments of chattering amongst themselves, the band's leader then smirked and waved for his friends to come over. Come on, guys. Get him. In the blink of an eye, the boys behind Naruto suddenly grabbed his arms and pushed him over, shoving him into the carpet. Hey, that's not fair, Naruto shouted, thrashing against the arms now attempting to restrain him as he was pushed to the floor. Let me go. Damn it. Kicking and lashing out, the blonde eventually managed to force the other kids to let go of him through brute force, and once again took a swing out at them. However, just as he was spinning around to take his anger out on Kato, he ended up tripping over his chair and falling clumsily to the floor. Yelping when he hit the carpet on his shoulder, the youngster looked up through squinted eyes. What he found staring back at him was the entirety of the class, their faces overshadowed and their eyes staring at him with mixtures of fear, amusement, disdain and indifference. It was this combination of expressions that had Naruto freeze up, as he looked between the faces of his classmates in confusion and alarm. In that moment, he heard them. Ha. Naruto fell over again. He snapped. Call the teacher. Kato. Run for it before he gets up. The echo of boys' and girls' voices speaking up all at once filled the room, making it incredibly difficult for Naruto to separate any of them. He didn't need to, however, as he was able to hear every whisper and every word spoken around him, as he lay there on his back with his legs tangled with his upturned chair. What's going on? Naruto thought he could do what he wants because Kato asked him to play with him. Gross. Haha. Naruto got mad while they were playing a game. What was he thinking? He won't ever get to be Hokage if he acts like that. Poor Kato. This is why Naruto doesn't have any friends. That last statement had the blonde youngster fall silent and his eyes, filled with embarrassment, remorse and hurt, gaze across the room vacuously. The familiar sensation of isolation, as well as the crushing pain of the entire world laying down all of its unfairness and injustice upon him, overwhelmed him and caused his eyes to tear up. Naruto then gritted his teeth and did his best to hold back the need to sob, lowering his head as a consequence. Eventually, the arrival of the teacher saved him from any further embarrassment, as he was then carted off to the headmaster's office. Ooh, why were you fighting? The voice of the headmaster hit Naruto as the blonde remained seated in front of the school's principal, his head held low in shame and his hands perched nervously on top of his lap. With the two of them being the only ones in the room, it made the youngster's situation feel even more helpless and frightening than it already seemed. Understandably, Naruto tried to ignore these oppressive sensations in order to save face, but was still unable to block out the voice of the school's chief administrator and overseer from scolding him for his supposed behavior. Mustering up whatever courage that he could, the orphan murmured. It's because Kato and his friends are always. He was promptly cut off by the older man in the Chunin uniform speaking, I heard you got mad while playing ninjas in the classroom. Is that true? Yes, Naruto replied, looking up towards the principal with a determined expression. Right now he wanted so badly to plead his case and profess his innocence, but the other kids always make me play the monster and never give me a chance to play the good guy. Can't you tell the difference between games and reality? That's not it, Naruto stuttered, feeling like he was being stopped from actually explaining the situation. Considering the seriousness of the situation and how he'd tossed a table back in the classroom, obviously the teachers were very concerned. However, it wasn't just because of what he did that he was being reprimanded. No, there was something else. Kato's really popular and everybody believes what he says, so he tells everyone it's my fault. He's the one who splashed the water on my picture. But everyone says you're the one who started the fight. A lot of your classmates got scared when you lashed out at them, the headmaster replied firmly, leaning forward and focusing his glare on the youngster, silencing him. What if a student had gotten hurt? What if a window had been broken? Gritting his teeth and clenching his fists in his shorts, the blonde snapped at the man. You're not listening. Ultimately, despite his best efforts, Naruto was sent home to the orphanage where he was then lectured to and reprimanded by the supervisor. This pretty much ended in a very unfortunate and unpleasant day for the youngster. 2 months later. Who do you think you're trying to be? A hero? You want to be Hokage someday? Ha! People like you never become Hokage. Eyes flickering open under the piercing glare of the midday sun, the miserable form of Naruto, wearing a blue shirt with an orange fire symbol on the front and green shorts, found himself lying sprawled out in the middle of the park, staring up at the clear blue sky. Feeling the numbness in his face and body slowly ebb away after several moments, the youngster then gave a pained groan when his brain finally registered to the fact that he was injured. The reason as to why revealed itself shortly thereafter, as memories of his most recent encounter with the local kids started to come back to him. Naruto remembered coming over to the park earlier that morning in a hopes of finding someone else to play with outside of the school and the orphanage. When he spotted a group of slightly older boys giving a young girl over by the sand pit a hard time, he stepped in to try and stop them. What followed from there was the blonde proclaiming himself the next great Hokage, in which the youngsters laughed and insulted him. After Naruto punched the leader, knocked him to the ground and started to beat on him in retaliation, the other 4 adolescents tackled him away and began their assault. Sure, little gutsy Naruto put up a good fight, using all of the anger and frustration he'd built up over the last several weeks to push him forward. He even managed to break one of the kids' noses and knock one of the others into a daze. But soon enough, the older kids managed to gain the upper hand. They surrounded him, pinned him to the ground, and pummeled him into submission, until the poor, lonely orphan was unable to move or fight back. The kids then laughed at him one last time, mocked his dreams of becoming Hokage, and left. That was only a few minutes ago and, with the bullies no longer in the area, all Naruto was left with for his troubles was a thoroughly bruised body, a couple of cracked ribs, a throbbing headache, and a half-blind eye. Needless to say, it was poor start to what the youngster guessed was going to be another wretched day. Someone with no friends and no family will never become a great ninja. You're a loser. Why don't you just go away? Naruto frowned to himself through his swollen cheek and eye as he replayed the memory of his beating at the hands of the delinquents in his head over and over again, as well as the scolding and vacant looks he received from the people he passed on the streets that morning. Seeing these images flicker in front of him for a full minute caused the orphan to instinctively clench his fists and stiffen his jaw angrily. Upon letting his rage swell to the point of bursting, the boy then released it with a heavy hiss and a whimper, and shut his eyes tightly. He then turned his head into the dirt that he was lying in and muttered. I'm so weak, so pathetic, the child whispered as a crushing sense of defeat and powerlessness fell over him for what felt like the 100th time in a row. Barely able to hold back his frustrations or his sadness, the child formed a fist and hit the ground. I can't even fend for myself, and nobody in this village cares. The fact that not a single adult he could see walking on the street on the other side of the park were even bothering to come over and help was proof of that, and only served to upset the child even more. They just walked on, minding their own business and not even sparing him a single glimpse of concern or curiosity. Even the adults that had been there at the time of the incident didn't care what had happened and simply ignored the scene, while the parents took their children away for their own safety. As the anxiety from these moments started to cut in deep and rattle his senses, Naruto felt a rush of hatred and rage envelop him. He wanted to scream at the people, to cry out and curse at them. He even had the inclination to get up, run out onto the road, and attack all those blank and emotionless faces turning a cold shoulder on him. All his years of loneliness and not understanding what the hell made people hate and despise him so came bubbling to the surface, filling him with an outrageous feeling of ire. He just wanted to do something, anything to get them to look at him, to get them to acknowledge that he was there and that he existed. He wanted them to see that he was a human being, just like them, and not some monster they were trying to avoid. However, thanks to the bruises he'd sustained, Naruto couldn't even muster the strength to budge an inch, and just lay there on the ground, staring off to the side with a dead look in his eyes as the rest of the world moved around him. It was like it didn't want anything to do with him. While he lay there, overcome by grief and helplessness, the boy slowly reached into his shirt and pulled out a red pendant with the whirlpool symbol hanging from a string around his neck. Even though he'd had this thing with him ever since he was born, he had no idea what it was or what it did. All he knew was that it was something precious to him, something he looked to for comfort, and was something that was familiar and close to his heart. So, after glancing down at the little amber-like gem glittering between his fingers, he then clutched it tightly in his palm and pulled it closer. Naruto then lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty playground as the heat of the day continued to beat down on him and allowing his anger to peter out, and slowly transform into misery and regret. He ignored the sun that flashed him in the face from between the clouds and the flies that buzzed around him, like they were hovering over the body of a dead animal. He may as well be dead for all he knew. Nobody wanted him. Hell, not even the caretakers or the children at the orphanage he stayed at cared if he was around. They treated him just like everybody else, with ignorance and displeasure. You don't have any friends and nobody likes you. That makes you the bad guy. A bad guy will never become the village leader. His memories of Kato and his friends resurfaced once again, playing back in his head like a horrible nightmare. Subsequently, the blonde's expression steeled and his limbs shook. So overwhelmed by the absurdity of it all, Naruto did his best in recounting all the things he knew in an attempt to find an answer behind his endless suffering. It was the only thing he could do at this time. Kato is always smiling. Kato is strong. Kato loves picking on the weak. Kato is loved by everyone. Kato is in. Kato is popular. Naruto then began considering the inverse. I'm always alone. I'm not strong. I hate people who pick on the weak. I have no friends. I have no family. I have no one. Everyone hates me. There was only one other person Naruto could relate to in regards to this comparison, and that was all the people in history who'd suffered at the hands of those who had everything: power, strength, friends, and fame. It was like the villains he read about in his story books at the orphanage, and how they were constantly being beaten by the main character who everybody adored. At first he admired the heroes and wanted to become just like that. But when he realized that the characters all reflected the exact same traits of the people that picked on him, he quickly started to develop a dislike for them. If there was anyone's struggles and pain he could really sympathize with, it was the poor sods who tried fighting against the world and those with power, but ended up going nowhere. In that moment, the young but bright Naruto saw the overwhelming unfairness in the world through his encounters with the kids at school and his interactions with the people across the village. The idea that the well-liked and popular people always end up one-sidedly beating down on the weak and hated people, and always getting their way, just didn't seem right in the orphan's eyes at all. It was a dreadful and disgusting reality that always meant one person getting hurt while the victors basked in their success. The hero, the strong in every single story, would always have the approval of those around them and inevitably rise to the top, while their opposites remain forgotten. It was a cycle that was repeated over and over again, both in fiction and in the real world. After all, it wasn't the villains' faces carved into the side of the Hokage monument. No, it was those who were loved and accepted by everyone. Don't you know? The bad guy is always supposed to lose, another boy's voice echoed in his head one last time. So I'm a bad guy, huh? Naruto thought, his frustration festering for several moments until, from out of nowhere, he became struck by a sudden sense of realization. A. Villain. Blinking as he gazed across the deserted playground for several moments, the youngster then rolled onto his side and, with a quiet groan, forced himself back to his feet. Swaying from the dizziness in his head and the bruise in his shin, the youngster stared at the climbing equipment with great intent. After several moments of tense silence and hearing the birds chirping overhead, the child then looked down at the pendant he was still holding and contemplated over his collection of thoughts. People who are liked, the strongest, smartest, and most popular people, they always win, Naruto murmured to himself, his brain slowly turning his thoughts into words. But the people who are hated, the ugly and weak bad guys, they always lose. They try so hard, and yet they always end up getting killed in every story. His eyes reflecting the light of his pendant, the blonde then gave his reasoning one last go-over, before allowing a big smile to spread across his lips. If everyone wants a bad guy so much, fine. All of this eventually led him to one last conclusion and, upon releasing the pendant from around his neck, the blonde looked across the expanse of Konohagakure and towards its most revered landmark. As soon as his eyes glued to the four faces watching over the community, the beaten and bruised blonde raised a hand towards it and held it over the mountain. Popular guys winning and unpopular guys losing. That stupid story has been told a gazillion times already, and it's getting really boring. With a determined grin appearing over his swollen lips, the blonde then clenched his fist around the four Hokage heads and visually crushed them inside his palm in a malicious manner. In that very instant, his resolve was steeled and his eyes set on one goal. It was lunchtime over at Konohagakure's Shinobi Academy and, as it was to be expected, it was a very active period for both the students and the teachers. In the foundations and junior primary areas of the playground, sandpit and pitch, the children could all be seen running around and having a good time, with each group enjoying a certain activity. So far there hadn't been any incidents or issues for the shinobi on duty to report and, as the hour ticked by, things were pretty peaceful. However, across the field and behind the tree line, out of sight of the teachers and children, there sat a wide open grove with a bunch of tri-level, climbing and monkey bars set up in random spots across the clearing. This particular area was often used by the upper primary and middle school physical education classes, where students were taken to practice their climbing and swinging skills in leading up to the more advanced levels of the shinobi curriculum. During recess and lunch periods this area often remained empty. But today, as it had been for the last 3 months, it was currently being occupied by only one person. This person happened to be the blonde-haired newcomer of the academy, Naruto Uzumaki, who was currently using the area for his own purposes. Propped up the middle of the tri-level bars in a handstand position, his legs and body pointed straight up towards the sky, the youngster in the white shirt and green shorts was slowly pushing himself up and down at an agonizingly slow pace. At the same time sweat trickled down his face and his muscles trembled, all the while the child counted his reps through a low and hoarse voice, which clearly illustrated the amount of effort he was using. 888, 889, 890, Naruto hissed as he diligently powered through his workout, even though his body was telling him to quit. 800 and, briefly forgetting the number he was supposed to say and stopping halfway through his representative, the adolescent quickly thought back through his basic counting skills, before breaking out a smirk and pushing on, 91, 892. Despite being in such a precarious and potentially dangerous position, the adolescent wasn't terrified or shaken in the least. In fact, he was greatly enjoying the exercise he was doing. This gave indication to the fact that Naruto had been practicing this technique a lot in the last several weeks, to the point where he was now able to perform it repeatedly without fault or fail. This much was obvious from the number he'd already counted to. Eventually, after reaching 1,000, the child then performed a gymnastic spin around the bar and hopped off, landing on the dirt gracefully. He then picked up his water bottle, took a swig, and moved over to the monkey bars to begin doing some chin-up exercises. When he was about to start said routine at end of the equipment, the bell to the end of lunch sounded, signaling for all the children to return to class. Naruto ignored it however and, focusing on the bars in front of him, jumped up and took a hold of the first one. They won't care if I'm there or not, the boy thought, knowing how his foundation teacher often forgot he was even there. So, deciding to give today's class a miss again, the child instead continued his workout, doing about 50 slow reps on the first bar before jumping to the another 2 over, and repeating. For the blonde, he had better things to do than attend classes to learn about friendship, the days of the week, and finger painting. He could do all that in his sleep. Right now he had other more important things to do, like getting his body strong and flexible enough for the next level of training. Being so driven to pursue his dream was more than enough to push Naruto to improve and refine his skills, so that he could surpass his classmates as well as everybody else who was older and stronger than him. You couldn't deny that the results of this kind of fortitude were definitely starting to show. Though Naruto was trying his very best to keep his new training routine hidden from everybody in his class and at the orphanage, there were some days where he just couldn't help but exercise in full view of the villagers. For the people living in the neighborhood near his orphanage, it soon became a common occurrence to see the youngster running down the road repeatedly over the course of an entire morning, doing parkour at the local reserve, or lugging a massive boulder about a few hundred kilograms up a hill over and over. It was these types of cardio and strength-based workouts that were a little more difficult for the youngster to conceal from the rest of the village. However, for all the other exercises revolving around gymnastics, static strength building, taijutsu and such, he could easily practice them out of sight of the public. In the weeks to follow since the start of his intense, militarized training program, Naruto had also taken on board Shuriken Jutsu and implemented the study and practice into his daily routine. For the children coming from big wig clans and families within the village, acquiring the tools to conduct this branch of shinobi training was easy and didn't result in any issues. Naruto, however, being an orphan of only 5 years of age with no family or clan of his own, struggled to get his hands on any weapons he needed to practice with. Not only were the teachers reluctant to lend a bunch of dangerous ninja tools to a minor, they were also hesitant about loaning them out to someone with such a bad reputation. This was something that really annoyed the blonde, but also encouraged him to think outside the box and discover different ways and means to practice. As it turns out, the driven and sharp-minded youngster was able to come up with an appropriate resource in the form of rocks and pebbles. Able to function as incredibly versatile projectiles, as well as giving him a variety of odd and complex shapes to work with, Naruto was able to use the very environment itself to load himself up on tools from which he was able to train with. Every time he wanted to practice his throwing, Naruto would find himself a quiet alleyway or a spot out in the park away from the village, and do some target practice by hawking rocks at various angles towards a number of strategically placed objects. These took the form of cans, discarded boxes with painted circles on them, pieces of tinfoil, and strings. Whenever he wasn't doing strength exercises or taijutsu lessons, the determined orphan would work on his throwing arm. At first his technique started out stiff, clumsy, and his aim was all over the place. But in studying some of the books he was able to come across at the Academy's Resource Center, he was able to modify and correct the aim, distance, and trajectory of his throws. Soon he was knocking over cans from an average distance of 80 to 100 yards a feet, which was quite impressive for a junior primary student with a handful of pebbles. However, it wasn't just distance and accuracy along a straight line Naruto was working on either. On this particular day, the child had opted for a different kind of practice. Standing in the middle of a dingy alleyway surrounded by trash cans with random targets set up around him, the boy was not only working on trying to throw multiple rocks at the same time, but was also attempting to alter their trajectories by ricocheting them and bouncing off of stationary targets to hit another. This would then hopefully lead to him being able to bounce rocks off of airborne rocks. Sure, it sounded simple in theory, but in reality it was ludicrously complicated. Panting heavily as he stood in the middle of the walkway, covered in dirt and bruises, with a cut over his temple, Naruto then crossed his arm over and chucked the handful of pebbles he had in his hand outwards. The 3 rocks flew out, spinning on their respective axis to pelt 3 different targets down the alley. Spinning around, the blonde grunted and chucked another pebble upwards, bouncing it off of trash can lid and up towards can, which he managed to knock over with a loud clatter. Gritting his teeth, the child then reached into his shorts pocket and drew another 2 rocks, which he clenched between his fingers. Not enough, the boy breathed out, glancing over his shoulder towards another 2 targets spaced out in the narrow space. Not good enough. With a yell, he turned and threw the rocks, watching them separate and strike their targets with 2 loud, clap, sounds echoing down the walkway. And so he kept on going, stopping every once in a while to reload. Several weeks later, pursuing a dream was one thing. Accomplishing it was another thing altogether. Naruto, however, didn't care about the difficulties of the path he'd chosen. In fact, the child was determined to do everything he could in order to realize it, even pushing aside all childish and immature inhibitions that would otherwise interfere with his goals. He learned early on that a smart person, as well as a strong person, had a better chance of surviving in the world than one who was ill-informed. So, during the times when he was not in school or training, Naruto was frequently visiting the village's central library so that he could learn about different ways of improving his training and about the greater world in general. If he was ever going to do anything of significance in the future, then he needed to cover all his bases, and make sure he had an understanding of everything going on around him. In the last couple of months, Naruto had not only studied up on chakra manipulation and combat techniques, but he'd also been indulging himself in stories of old. He'd learn about past historical events, important figures in history and society, and how all of them came together to shape the world to how it was today. And it wasn't just events around Konoha that he studied, but places and countries all over. Doing so not only made him wiser, but also more knowledgeable of the village and the clans living in it. Naruto found this kind of studying to be fascinating and inspiring, as he was able to gain a better idea of right and wrong, and learn from the mistakes of those who came before him. Today the orphan was touching up on his history of the world's greatest tyrants, leaders and criminals. By looking a little closer at these figures and their profiles, Naruto felt like he could learn a great deal about their methods, their ways of thinking, their personalities, and how their conquests influenced and shaped the world. To do this, he had to start from the basics, and get a feel for what these people were like before he started emulating any of them. So there he saw, at a quiet desk in the middle of the library, with a stack of books on either side of him, historical, cultural, and shinobi related. The item he currently had open in front of him was an issue of the Bingo book, from a few years ago, which had since become outdated and retired to the archives. Naruto's eyes were practically glowing in awe as he studied up on the people recorded in the chapters. Name: Uchiha Naka, aka Shinku Yurei, Crimson Spectre. Date of birth: June 7, XX09. Gender: male. Affiliation: Konohagakure. Rank: Jonin. Hair color: black. Height: 178 centimeters. Bounty: 55 million ryo. Classification: S-Class, Rogue Ninja Terrorist. Status: deceased. Naruto whispered to himself as he went over the description of the page he was on, while at the same time inspecting the profile of the person in question. History: as a former member of the Uchiha clan of Konohagakure, Naka made a name for himself as a genius and a master of his family's Kekkei Genkai, the Sharingan, as well as its more advanced form, the Mangekyo Sharingan. A prodigy since his time at the academy, Naka was promoted to Chunin at only 12 years of age and achieved the rank of Jonin at 15. Skilled in both ninjutsu, genjutsu, and daiki and shotai styles of kenjutsu, in his youth Naka was capable of taking down even the most battle-hardened and experienced shinobi in combat. His skills at casting illusions was so great, he was able to throw them while using ninjutsu to confuse and overwhelm his enemies. Glancing the man's face over and reading into the details of his specialties, Naruto then continued on with his profile. His awakening of the Mangekyo Sharingan soon led him to discovering the forbidden genjutsu. The name of it was crossed out, which had the blonde frown, which enabled him to cheat death. Doing so allowed him to, on multiple occasions, also blacked out, assassinating fellow members of his clan. The blonde blinked at this odd line of information. Wondering why a lot of sections had been blacked out in this text, the young man moved on with his reading. This obsession with using the technique soon led to his defection from Konohagakure, and later being classified as a rogue shinobi and a terrorist. Eventually he was tracked down by his former comrade in arms Naori Uchiha, who captured him and brought him back to the village to be tried for his crimes. Processing the information, a clearly impressed Naruto then moved on through the next few pages. It was then he came upon another familiar face in the book, one that he'd seen illustrated many times in other documents, as well as previous volumes of this text. The face of the person, though black and white, was still clearly visible through the faded ink. Name: Uchiha Madara, aka Shinku Akuma, Crimson Devil, Maber no Hakai, Harbinger of Destruction, and Mijimena no Konohagakure, Scourge of the Hidden Leaf. Date of birth: December 24th. Gender: male. Affiliation: Konohagakure, formerly. Rank: NA. Hair color: black. Height: 179 centimeters. Former bounty: 800 million double Ryo. Classification: SS rank, rogue ninja terrorist. Status: deceased. Naruto read, his eyes panning over the long-haired photo of the individual in question, before then turning to the writing below. The eldest of 5 sons, Madara was the legendary, former leader of the Uchiha clan and one of the 2 founding members of Konohagakure. Along with the future first Hokage, Hashirama Senju, both he and Madara would go on to lay the foundations to one of the most powerful villages on the continent. Having been born during the warring periods prior to the formation of the hidden village system, Madara was a man raised and molded by battle. In his lifetime, he'd endured months of war and strife against rival clans, and conflicts incited from numerous continental factions, from which he drew a great deal of his education and experience. His talent and aptitude for the ninja arts was so great that in his prime, he was considered one of the most powerful shinobi in the world. Wow, this guy sounds pretty awesome, Dadbeo. In reading through the profile of Madara, Naruto not only felt a great deal of respect towards the individual, but a certain level of envy for his reputation alone was enough to inspire him to become better and stronger, someone who could make a person of such astonishing strength and influence look like a pup. Madara's mastery over the Mangekyo Sharingan was unlike any witnessed before in the history of his clan, enabling him to cast powerful genjutsu, alter probability, provide him a keen level of foresight during battle, and allowed him to produce a Susanoo armor with the size and capacity of leveling an entire battlefield. Shrugging at this information, Naruto then moved on down and narrowed his eyes on the paragraphs to follow. After the formation of Konoha, Madara's views on the changing world gradually became twisted and disjointed, as he believed the Senju were seeking to oppress his family. As a result, he later abandoned the village. Gaining control of the 9-tailed demon fox, which had been wandering the wilds during that period, the Uchiha then waged a one-man war against the rest of the world. His first incursion into the southern nations in an attempt to destroy the newly formed villages of Kusagakure and Omegakure was effectively halted when legendary shinobi and former samurai, the water demon, Hanzo Hattori, grandfather of Hanzo of the Salamander, stepped in and fought him off. Madara and the Kyuubi were then relegated to the north of the Land of Fire, where they encountered Hashirama Senju. The pair fought for 3 days, creating a massive chasm that would later be called the Valley of the End, until Hashirama bested and killed Madara, putting an end to his rebellion. Give me a few years and I'll become twice as strong as this clown, Naruto thought. After thoroughly reading through this section of the book, Naruto then turned to the notepad next to him and began scribbling down some dot points. Once he'd gotten all of the information he wanted, he then flipped through the previous chapters of the book, passing over other criminals such as Fuma Kotaro, Sarutobi Akuma, and the brothers Ginkaku and Kinkaku. It was then he stopped at a rather interesting looking profile that was marked by red tape and the extremely dangerous label, and began perusing over the details. Name: Shuden Doji. Date of birth: unknown. Gender: female. Affiliation: unknown. Rank: NA. Hair color: black. Height: 190 centimeters. Bounty: 1 billion double Ryo. Classification: Triple S rank, demon. Status: unknown. Naruto read while glancing across at the photo of what looked like a buxom young woman sitting by a pond with black hair, pale skin and two large horns growing out of her head. It was that last aspect that had him do a double take on the picture, which looked as though it was shot from a long distance away, as the image was very blurry and out of focus. Figuring that the horns were probably a result of a trick in the light, the boy kept on reading. The unholy offspring of darkness and death itself. Very little is known about this individual and many speculate as to her actual origins. However, it is known that about 8 years ago a detachment of Konoha shinobi led by Minato Namikaze encountered this being at the base of a northern mountain while hunting down a group of Jashin supporters attempting to unseal a gate to the pure world. When they opened it, the creature emerged, and the squad from Konoha attempted to seal it again. There was then a large section of the text blacked out, which had Naruto shake his head over the possible reason, before quickly scrolling down to the bottom. After 4 days and nights of constant fighting, in which an entire village was wiped from the face of the map, the Konoha shinobi were effortlessly defeated. Looking warily across at the figure, Naruto then read on. Based on their encounter with it, Minato Namikaze, Makoto Uchiha, and the surviving ninja reported that its supernatural powers were unlike any ever encountered in the history of shinobi. Merely a single glance from this entity caused the Jashin supporters to crumble into dust, and the ground and forest around them to rot from her presence. If spotted, never engage this individual. Recommended approach: flee on sight. Tilting his head at the page, Naruto looked over his shoulder to check to see if anyone was watching him. Seeing nobody wasn't, the blonde then discreetly took a ruler, pressed it into the center of the open book, and quietly ripped the section out. He then folded it up and pocketed it. I'll keep this for later, Naruto thought, figuring he'd save it for future study. Information about a monster that earned a classification of this magnitude certainly deserved a more in-depth look. Besides, if he was going to make it to the top of the world as the most dangerous thing on this planet in every class and category, he had to familiarize himself with the competition. The prospect of finding out more about these demons and their abilities was so great that Naruto could barely contain the excited smirk that crossed his face. Calming himself down a few seconds later, the child then returned to his reading and continued to peruse through the many books he'd picked out. He still had an entire day of free time left to kill, and he wasn't going to waste a single second of it. The following weekend. One Saturday morning, having spent the better part of it after training wandering around the village aimlessly since the crack of dawn, the lonely and incredibly bored Naruto, his orange vest's hoodie pulled up over his head, had decided to go for an explore of the local neighborhood. So far his adventure through this upper-class part of the village had been relatively uneventful, with the majority of the villagers he'd passed steering clear of him, as usual, while he ambled down the road with his hands in his pockets. Keeping his face hidden, the youngster was kind of lost in his thoughts, which were dominated by ideas and thoughts on his training, as well as all the studying he'd been doing. While he was ambling down a road behind some private estates in an area he wasn't too familiar with, the blonde's head perked up when he picked up the distinct sounds of shouting and talking. Tracing the sound towards one of the properties a little further down the dirt path, the aspiring bad guy jogged on over to check it out. Vaulting up onto the ceramic roof of the wall surrounding the home, the boy then crouched down on the platform and took a quick peek at the garden. Much to his surprise, the youngster found himself staring down at an enormous dirt courtyard with over 24 children standing in the center of it, boys and girls around his age, with brown and dark blue hair respectively, and all dressed in matching gray training GIS. What's more, all the kids were arranged into rows and dropped into horse riding stances, and were currently practicing palm thrusts under the supervision of their trainer. Every time they threw an attack, all the children shouted at the top of their lungs and in perfect unison. There was a brief pause between each strike and, during every pause, the teacher walking between their rows would come up behind one of the children and correct their stance or position, just to make sure they were doing the exercise properly. This meticulous and repetitive form of practice was something that would normally be found in a typical dojo or a self-defense class, where youngsters were trained for competition purposes or otherwise. But as Naruto observed from his spot on top of the perimeter wall, this wasn't just some ordinary martial arts class. On closer inspection, the blonde quickly realized that he'd actually wandered into the Hyuga clan district and had just happened to come across one of their private compounds, where members of the powerful family were currently practicing the basic techniques associated with their world-famous taijutsu style, Juken, gentle fist. This was something that Naruto wasn't expecting to stumble across while on his little village walk, but it certainly wasn't unwelcome. In fact, the blonde cracked a genuine smile as he made himself comfortable and proceeded to watch the class with interest. As the children continued going through their palm exercises, their instructor, a tall Hyuga kunoichi with bob-style brown hair, pale skin, crystal blue eyes, a scar across her right cheek, and wearing a purple chi-pao kimono, walked between them with a stern expression in play. During which time she began to speak. Remember, every movement you make must be accompanied by a breath, and every step a pause. You must be fluid with each of your strikes, but also decisive, inhaling and exhaling throughout. Any attempts to hold yourself back or restrict your movements will result in rigid attacks and a fragile defense. She then stepped over to a young girl and pushed her arm up when she noticed she was hitting too low. Feel the ground and your surroundings. Breathe and maintain your focus. And never let your guard down. Understand? Hi, Sensei. The collective response of the students echoed across the area, informing the kunoichi that all of her students understood. With a nod, she then turned around and headed back out of the formation to begin moving around the outside. Change it up. Crescent repulse and double palm strikes. On my count. She then heard a loud stomp as every single child stepped forward with their left foot and assumed offensive stances. Ready. 1, 2, 3. The woman counted on and watched as all of her students began executing 2 simultaneous techniques one after the other with both arms. Naruto became incredibly fascinated and enamored in the training session taking place in front of him and continued to watch for the next few minutes. Upon seeing the kunoichi woman sternly correct 4 of her students by having the others stop and getting the offenders to perform the techniques individually, the blonde then decided to join in. He did so by standing up, assuming the gentle fist stance that the children were using, and copying their movements at the kunoichi's count. His arms moved in semi-circles around his body as he performed a stepping flourish, followed by a return of both palms to the front before pushing out with them. He then repeated the motion over and over, making sure to stick the pattern and maintain his footing on the tiled roof. When he felt his body was too rigid, he matched his breathing techniques with his body movements and, sure enough, he started to execute his technique with grace and precision. For the next half an hour Naruto stood on that wall, copying and mimicking the techniques being practiced down below. When the children moved into practicing simultaneous deflection and counter-attacks with a partner, Naruto continued, practicing being both the attacker and the defender with his own shadow. During this period, the kunoichi instructor below suddenly took notice of the blonde boy up on the wall. As her students continued on with their session, She watched the whisker-marked child in the hoodie for several moments, raising an eyebrow as she took notice of how he was executing each technique with confidence and poise. Unfortunately, just as Naruto was getting into the swing of the practice, he suddenly heard a voice yell out to him. "Hey, you!" Looking down at the street, the orphan suddenly spotted a Hyuga male with a ponytail and wearing a shinobi uniform glaring up at him. A rather irritated expression was currently slapped across his face. "What do you think you're doing up there? Get down. Now." Uh-oh. Quickly disengaging from his stance, a surprised Naruto turned tail and ran, jumping down from the wall and sprinting away as fast as he could. The Hyuga Chunin gave chase, but then gave up halfway down the road when the child managed to disappear around the corner seconds later. Figuring it wasn't worth going after him, Hoito Hyuga gave a low sigh and turned to head back inside. The Kunoichi instructor meanwhile, after seeing the blonde take flight, cracked a small smile before returning to coach her students, all of whom had been too busy to notice the commotion going on nearby. A couple months later, that first visit to the Hyuga clan compound wouldn't be Naruto's last. In fact, after his little peeping session and eventual run-in with the Chunin, the orphan began visiting the estate every day at the exact same time, so that he could watch and observe the taijutsu classes being held in that central courtyard. After the first 2 weeks, the orphan was quickly able to get a solid grasp of all the times that each of the classes were held. There were 2 classes held on the weekends in the morning and afternoon, and 1 held every day during the week in the evenings. During these brisk 2-hour periods, the youngest members of the clan's main and branch family members would gather together and form into rows, which were divided by age and experience. From there, under the keen eye of their Jonin instructor, the children would then practice their basic techniques including stances, footwork, and handwork before being paired up to practice through sparring. Thanks to his frequent attendance to these proceedings, Naruto was given plenty of opportunities to observe and record how all of them practiced. The blonde's part wasn't just limited to being a spectator either. Over the course of the next 2 months, Naruto was also able to join in on some of the classes from a distance, allowing him to work on the techniques and skills being taught at the same time as the children. He was also able to correct himself by also copying the movements of the children and making all the corrections the teacher pointed out to the students. Barring any interruptions he may have with any Hyuga clan guards that happened to be on duty, Naruto was able to get a full and worthwhile morning or afternoon taijutsu session with his training schedule. And so another addition was added to Naruto's timetable, and the aspiring villain in training continued on with his day-to-day life without issue. But his days of peace and isolation weren't to last forever. As it turns out, the caretakers at the orphanage started to grow a little bit concerned with the blonde's absences in the early mornings and late afternoons, with the head of the facility taking this issue up directly with the Hokage. At the behest of the supervisor, Hiruzen Sarutobi then approached Naruto and asked if the child wanted to be moved into an apartment that would be more beneficial for his needs. Seeing no problems with moving into an apartment on his own, as it would grant him a lot more freedom than what he had with his current arrangement, Naruto accepted the elder's proposal and happily went with the village leader on a tour of the available apartments. Throughout the venture the blonde wore a big smile, which helped in concealing his true motivations as to why he wanted a place to himself. It certainly fooled the Hokage. This endeavor took up most of an entire day, where the pair walked from one apartment to another in search of one that would be best suited for the youngster. Eventually the pair happened upon a quiet, 6-tatami mat flat on the east side of the village complete with a hot spring in the back and a laundromat just down the block next to a convenience store. Quickly developing a liking to the small but practical apartment, which sat close by to all the places he needed, Naruto quickly informed the Hokage that he would take it, and was promptly given both a key and a contract. Hiruzen was really pleased to see the blonde so excited to be moving into his own home. After hearing for himself that the youngster would be able to take care of himself, the elder then gave the boy a quick rundown of the establishment's rules and time schedules. Once he'd done that, the elder then gave Naruto his first allowance for the fortnight and headed on his way, leaving the blonde to his own devices. And so, after buying all the necessary equipment and supplies he needed for his new place of residence, Naruto's life as an independent miner began in earnest. The blonde learned quickly how living in a flat was different from being in a dorm. For one, he wasn't sharing the room with anybody else, other than himself, and didn't have any other children in the bunks opposite him snoring away. He also didn't have to keep an eye out for the caretaker, who would normally be giving any of the orphans an earful if they were ever caught breaking a rule of the house or doing something inappropriate. Here, Naruto didn't have to worry about any of those, except for the opening and closing periods of the washing up area. Along with the adjustments to his new living conditions, Naruto's training also progressed at a steady and ideal pace. Towards the end of his school year, his gymnastic training advanced to a higher tier, his strength-building training began including heavier weights that wouldn't stunt his growth, his cardio sessions were increased, his focus on taijutsu included a further studying and inclusion of more styles, and his attendance at the library was also increased. Eventually the end of his preschool year came around and Naruto was set to move on to his junior primary years. Winter had pulled around and, as the days grew short and the nights grew long, snow started to fall over the land of fire, blanketing the entire countryside in a layer of white. This marked the first winter season Naruto would spend in his new home. It would also be his first winter season spent alone and, with the new changes in conditions, meant a potentially new area of learning for him. On one particular day, as he was wandering through the snow filling the roads of his village, the young Naruto had decided to go for yet another wander through the village, familiarizing himself with the odd terrain. Wearing a thick, hooded orange jacket and a pair of khaki pants, the young blonde had stopped by a convenience store and bought himself a couple of instant ramen cups and a hot water flask. Having prepared a cup a little while earlier, Naruto was currently digging into it as he strolled down the side road at a steady pace. During which time the 6-year-old scarcely noticed the buildings around him becoming more and more dilapidated the further in he went. Passing by a few closed stores and bars, the blonde then gave a quick glance towards one of the alleys he passed, and stopped when he noticed a couple of people sitting against the wall and staring at him. There, hiding in the shadow of a couple of crates and covered by a thick blanket, were a couple of children, a boy and a girl and their mother, all of whom dressed in old, tattered clothing, and covered in gunk. Obviously homeless, the trio were all huddled together for warmth, with the brother and sister having spotted Naruto walking by and were now looking at him with interest and worry. Staring at the group of vagrants for a moment, Naruto swallowed the food in his mouth and considered the family for a moment. Seeing people living on the streets in Konohagakure wasn't an entirely new or rare thing. It was common knowledge to a lot of people that many conflicts and wars had taken place in recent years, which had left a lot of civilians and foreigners without homes or places to return to. As a result, the Hidden Leaf village had generously taken in a number of refugees and families who'd lost everything. Though the council had managed to help out a few of these displaced groups, there were a number of stragglers who were still out of sorts, and had to resort to finding places to stay with whatever belongings they had left. Some of those who were too broke or didn't have anything at all had unfortunately ended up in places like this in the poor and rundown areas of the village where there were few authority figures and people to chase them off. Expression reflecting a sense of sadness at the single mother's and her children's misfortune, the orphan then looked down at the bag he was carrying and the clothes he was wearing. After thinking on it for a moment and looking to see the family was shivering in the cold, the youngster smiled and approached them. He then stopped in front of the group and held the bag he was holding out. "Here. Do you guys want some?" Receiving no answer, except seeing the children look at their mother in surprise, Naruto simply smiled and, moving over, sat down next to them. He then set his bag down and began pulling out the cups of ramen and a couple sets of chopsticks, all the while being watched by the family. "I'm more than happy to share these with you. I've got some pork and spicy ramen in here, and a couple others. They taste really good. The child then proceeded to open the cupped ramen and pour the hot water from his flask into them. From there they then waited, with both the blonde and the children watched the noodles simmer for about 2 minutes. Stirring to make sure the noodles broke apart and separated, the blonde then handed noodles to each of the kids, watching with satisfaction as expressions of joy filled their faces. Thank you, the little girl with dark hair chirped when Naruto handed a cup over to her, at the same time licking her lips eagerly. Naruto beamed at the words of gratitude and then handed another cup over to the mother, who smiled warmly at the generous youngster and accepted it greatly with a quiet, "Thank you," of her own. After which the family sat together and ate a warm meal, with the blonde watching quietly right alongside them. Exhaling a light cloud of heat, the boy then turned his gaze towards the street around him and, as time ticked by, became lost in his thoughts. Over the winter, his little run-in with the family told young Naruto that he still knew very little about the world, its problems, its intricacies, and its issues, and that he had very little experience about many aspects of it. Though he was an orphan, born and raised within a structured system that both provided for him and shunned him, he had very little idea of what other people in less fortunate situations than him had to endure. Not only that, but he also had no idea what the world was like outside of the safety of Konohagakure's walls and what dangers were lurking out there. This was knowledge and information that he felt was worth going out to explore and research, and though he wasn't quite ready to leave the security of the village's boundaries just yet, there were still other things he could try while within them. As an extra addition to his development and learning to becoming a stronger person, Naruto decided that for the next year or so he would discard the luxuries and comforts of his apartment. Locking it up and imparting the key with the landlord for safekeeping, the blonde then went out into the streets to see what life was like from a vagrant's point of view. He wanted to be able to experience this kind of life for himself without the backing of the system, while at the same time continue his training regimen under more dire circumstances. After all, pain and hardship was something that he had to grow up with. It was something he'd had to endure for a long time, and it's also what drove him to pursue his dream. So he will continue to follow this path, and identify himself with the pain and suffering of others, all in order to gain a better understanding of the world around him. So for the next several months Naruto lived life on the edge, staying on the streets, wandering the dark alleys, and finding shelter in forgotten and abandoned buildings. At one point he came down with a flu, and at another time he was almost robbed by a homeless person, moments that made his test harder and almost unbearable. But all in all, his new surroundings enabled him to get a good, hard look at the hidden leaf and its society from a completely new perspective, where he had to rely solely on his own means and whatever resources he could find. On that note, all the money the Hokage gave him as part of his fortnightly allowance for this period, Naruto gave away to the people who needed it more, which made him feel better all around as a person. Though this show of charity did mean he had to go hungry on some days, he was still able to provide for himself through a variety of different means. He was able to compensate for his lack of funds by learning how to fish from the local river and hunt in the woods for whatever game he could find. It gave him plenty of practice in the art of tracking and trapping, and he was able to hone these skills frequently and effectively. But aside from these slight moments of reprieve, Naruto still went on living off of the bare minimum. Heck, he even wore his clothes to the point that they started to fall apart on him, forcing him to scrounge, steal or borrow whatever replacements he could get his hands on, so as to trade in for the ones that disintegrated over time. Though it wasn't easy and it went against a lot of his views on the rules of a normal lifestyle, it did give him a greater exposure to an aspect of community and environment that would have previously gone over his head. The hardest part about this whole thing, of course, wasn't the weather, the conditions surrounding him, the lack of companions or anything like that. No, it was actually keeping up with his training while being hampered by the cold and lack of food. He continued visiting the Hyuga clan compound, where he was able to practice the gentle fist style in the shadow of the groups from either the rooftop of the entrance. Of course, every once in a while during the training sessions, he was chased off by the Chunin that would sometimes be patrolling the perimeter of the compound. But on most days he was lucky and he was able to get a full session into his routine. When not visiting them, he would practice other styles in conjunction with the sleek and graceful movements of the Hyuga, including the hard fist, snake fist, shadow fist and more. What's more, whenever he discovered a new style in the library that he knew would help him, he would take it and begin practicing it religiously. The free-flowing movements and power displayed by masters of the martial arts really drew Naruto to them in a very primal way, as they presented an image of poise, power, confidence, and extreme discipline that he himself sorely lacked. If there was a chance that he could become a powerful villain through hand-to-hand fighting alone, one that could overwhelm enemies with his own strength without having to rely on the same chakra as everybody else, then he was going to pursue it with every iota of his being. When Naruto's next year of school came along, he stayed the course of his training, remaining on the streets at night while studying at the academy or training in the woods by day. A few months later. Second term. Who the heck are you? The conceited voice of a young girl suddenly filled the air as she and her friends glared behind them at the person who'd approached them. Judging from their outraged expressions, it was clear that they did not like the fact that they'd been interrupted from their little game. Of course, the situation that was currently unfolding in the clearing just off of the playground and climbing courses outside of the academy wouldn't exactly be considered fun. Gathered around a tall oak tree and surrounded by a grove of flowers, a group of about 3 young girls in their first year of school were standing with their backs turned to a fourth girl, who was currently kneeling on the ground in tears after some rather hurtful lashing. Obviously being the antagonists in this scenario, the group of youngsters were now staring down a blonde, spiky-haired boy wearing a ragged-looking white and orange jacket, a green, stained scarf, and tattered blue shorts. He was looking at the trio with an expression akin to a dead fish, which didn't exactly scream scary or intimidating in any way, but from the current look of dreadfulness and exhaustion on his face, he didn't appear worried in the least. Stepping forward from her troop, the purple-haired girl in the striped shirt and pack leader folded her arms and smirked at the child. "What do you want, Whiskers? Can't you see we're busy here?" Naruto, having clearly been through a rather rough day himself, glanced past the 3 girls to the fourth behind them, where he spotted the pink-haired form of who he recognized as one of his classmates. Sakura Haruno, if he remembered correctly, dressed in a nice red shirt and skirt, with long pink hair. Noticing that her knees were scuffed and that she was sobbing as she stared back at him through the locks of her messy fringe, the whiskered blonde gave a couple of blinks before then turning to the 3 girls, who'd once again taken a step closer to him. The now impatient-looking Amy leant forward and glared right at the boy, hoping that her friend's presence would prompt the child to back off. "Well, speak up. Aren't you going to say something? Or are you too stupid to answer the question for yourself? Yeah, come on, runt," the tall, ginger-haired Kasumi spoke with her usual gruff tone. "Give us something. Otherwise we'll just have to flatten you like we did to forehead girl, here." She said this while gesturing back to the girl on the grass, who quickly looked up when she was addressed. Through the haze of tears still fresh in her eyes, the pinkett spotted the blonde boy confronting the 3 girls that had been picking on her out of sight of any of the teachers. Realizing that he was now drawing their attention away from her, the girl at first felt relief, until she saw them begin to circle the boy. This immediately had her look up in worry, as she was well aware of how aggressive Amy and her friends were, especially towards boys. Hopefully they wouldn't do anything bad to him. He was on his own after all. Exhaling deeply at the incredibly fierce stares he was receiving from the trio in front of him, the bored Naruto then responded in a flat voice. "The 3 of you are in my way. Could you please move so that I can get past?" Amy balked, staring at the boy in surprise. "What did you just say to me?" Not reacting emotionally in any way, The unflinching Naruto repeated his response. I asked if you could move. Oh, you want us to move, huh? Kasumi huffed and stomped forward. Why don't you just go around us? The spiky-haired Fuki asked with a foul glare directed towards the blonde. It's not like you have to walk very far. Amy then raised a hand and waved at the blonde. You're annoying. Go away. Closing his eyes and breathing a heavy sigh, Naruto then looked up at the three girls to see Ami's two friends advance on him. Look, I'm trying to be nice, and I'm doing my best to not cause any trouble at school. But if you three don't move in the next few seconds, I'm going to start breaking noses from idiot to idiot, because I'm not in the mood for messing around. A familiar scenario then started developing again, as the blonde felt the encroaching feeling of being ganged up on. Honestly, it was a feeling that pissed him off and began revving the metaphorical engine inside of him. You want to do what? The imposing Kasumi asked while stepping up to the slightly shorter Naruto to stare him right in his tired face. Looking him up and down, the big girl huffed. Your clothes are dirty and gross. And you smell funny, Fuki exclaimed, at the same time pinching her nose to illustrate the problem. Naruto's eye twitched as a result. That's because I found these clothes in a fabric dumpster, jerks. If they knew what he was doing outside of school, they would probably understand. But he highly doubted it. These girls obviously weren't doing his kind of training or probably any. Nobody. Like you can't give us orders, Amy said a little louder, also getting up into the blonde's face. With a huff, she then reached up and poked him in the chest, hard. Now beat it, loser. Touching the blonde turned out to be her big mistake, as in a blink of an eye Naruto effortlessly grabbed her hand with his right and twisted it in a textbook Z-shaped lock, turning it downwards and forcing Amy to bend with it. The girl's eyes widened the moment her body started bending towards the floor as a sharp pain shot up her limb. Ow 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 ow. Expression remaining unchanged, the boy then saw the two girls beside Amy about to step in to help her. Acting on instinct, the boy changed the hold he had on the purple-haired girl, spinning her around so that she had her back to him and her arm locked behind her. Upon doing so, Naruto then reached up, pushed his hand through his hair and slicked it back. He then gave the two girls a very threatening smirk, which had Kasumi and Fuki back away when they felt the boy's ire on them. Would you girls do me a favor and walk away now? Naruto asked in a gravely tone of voice, warning them if they tried anything he would hurt them. Looking between the youngster and Amy, whom gave a pained yelp when the boy tightened his hold on her wrist and intensified the lock, Kasumi and her friend then wisely took a step back. Sure. Thanks for understanding, Naruto hissed, before then releasing Amy and shoving her forward. Almost immediately upon being released, the terrified girls then took flight, leaving Naruto and Sakura alone, the latter of whom couldn't help but stare after them in bewilderment. Upon seeing the trio leave, the Pinkett then turned to the boy who helped her, only to find he was standing directly beside her. She jumped a little when she looked up to see him glaring down at her, his eyes narrowed darkly and blonde locks still slicked back, giving the impression that he was going to attack her as well. However, just when Sakura leaned away in preparation for yet another aggressive confrontation that she did not want, the blonde orphan spoke in his raspy voice. Why were those three giving you such a hard time? Not knowing what to say at first, Sakura sniffled before quickly bringing her hands up to cover her face. They were making fun of my forehead, and telling me I was ugly. Really? Naruto then tilted his head at the girl's appearance, looking to see if there was anything wrong. He then leant forward and pushed aside the bangs hanging over her face, causing Sakura to curl up a little more and clench her eyes shut. After inspecting it for himself, the blonde grunted and let her bangs fall back into place. I don't see anything wrong. You look perfectly fine to me. Blinking, the girl looked up at him in surprise. Really? Yeah, Naruto nodded, before then slipping his hands back into his pockets, gestured in the direction the bullies had ran. You shouldn't let those girls pick on you and call you names, or anybody else. If you let them walk all over you now, then they'll keep doing that, and call you a weakling for the rest of your life. Trust me, it will suck. Noticing the Pinkett staring up at him through her veil of pink hair with a look of awe and amazement, the blonde felt a tad bit of discomfort overcome him. Feeling his face heat up, the sullen youngster turned around. If you want to stop them from pushing you around, train, work hard, and get strong enough so that people will be too afraid to mess with you. He then walked away, not wanting to be around if the girls decided to go fetch a teacher. As Sakura watched the boy walk towards the forest and away from the children on the playground, the child felt an overpowering sense of motivation and wonder settle in. Not only was she moved by the mysterious boy's words and tone, but upon looking back at his actions and remembering how he so handily chased those girls away from her, the Pinkett also felt a great deal of reverence to his confidence and skills. She'd never seen another boy act and talk like that, with such a calm and poised disposition. It was almost like he was a grown-up, even though some of the words he spoke didn't belong to an adult. When the image of his face looking down at her crossed her mind once again, his piercing blue eyes, rugged face, and whiskers framed by his slicked-back blonde hair, Sakura felt a bit of heat swell up in her cheeks. As a result, her hands and stomach clenched a little tighter, as a surge of energy washed through her. If you want to stop them from pushing you around, train, work hard, and get strong enough so that people will be too afraid to mess with you. His words echoed through her head like a ring from a bell, filling her with newfound feeling of enlightenment and confidence. He's so cool, Sakura whispered. 2 weeks later. 1. Ha. 2. Ha. 3. Ha. Dig deep. Find your inner strength. Let the enemy know you are delivering the blow, not receiving it, the firm, commanding voice of the female Hyuga instructor shouted as she walked between the rows of 20 adolescent branch and main clan students. Her hands propped behind her and white eyes wide open, the female with the scar across her cheek scanned the rows of tiny soldiers in front of her, watching as they were all assumed in a striking position. Palms fully extended, the children, all arranged in order from youngest to oldest, remained locked in position with their eyes focused on the area ahead of them. It was a very dignified spectacle, seeing all the young members of the clan sticking to their task and listening to their teacher so diligently. Obviously she was greatly respected by the members of her clan. The brown-haired woman then spotted a discrepancy amongst her ranks and marched forward, grabbing the guard hand of one of her students and nudging it towards his ribs. She then stepped back as the child in question, a young Hyuga male with dark brown hair tied into a top knot, broke out a worried sweat. In this position, keep the hand positioned over your center mass to protect your vital areas. Do not give the enemy any openings to exploit. Understood. Hi, Fujiko-sensei. The boy shouted back, at the same time firming up his stance. Nodding, the woman then moved on down the rows towards the back, inspecting everyone's stances. After lightly stepping on the back foot of a student who had overextended it, prompting him to slide it back into place, she then stopped at the final row when she noticed something odd about the formation. It wasn't the fact that the students were doing anything incorrectly, no. All of them were lined up and standing perfectly. It was the fact that one of the students, who was standing on the far left of the arrangement, wasn't a member of any of the Hyuga clan families at all. Naruto, who'd been watching from the entrance since the start of the lesson a few minutes ago, had decided to come out to join the class and inserted himself into their ranks. Hoping that he wouldn't get noticed, the child had stripped himself down to a pair of long blue pants that he'd borrowed from a donation box and tacked on a white, tattered oriental top with patches in it and had obviously been worn by a child practicing martial arts. He'd managed to slip into the back row of 7-year-old Hyuga students and had been practicing the techniques with their class unnoticed. That was until the instructor, Fujiko, marched towards the back to inspect her troops. Needless to say, it was a rather bizarre and unexpected turn of events. For the next minute the kunoichi stood there staring down at the boy curiously, at the same time watching as several of the other students turned their attention to him, but remained in their stances. After looking over the out-of-place 6-year-old for a moment, the woman raised an eyebrow as she saw he was doing his best not to move in any way. This was obvious from the way he had his eyes fixed on the space ahead and all his focus on the lesson. This is the child that's been showing up and watching our lessons for the last few months, Fujiko thought, her eyes tracing over his build and taking note of his form. He hasn't missed a single one. This much was clear from how clean and steady his stance was. She hadn't seen anything like it. After several moments of tense silence and watching the blonde sweat a little bit out of sheer nerves, Fujiko then cracked a smile and looked back at her class. Noticing the children were looking back at her, her expression steeled once more and she shouted, "Hey! Who said any of you could break form?" She then watched all the children snap back to their previous positions before she once again glanced down at the newcomer. "Keep that stance tight and center of gravity low. Understand?" Naruto nodded. "Hi, let's get back to it," the Hyuga woman shouted, keeping her hands locked behind her while moving back towards the front. Twisting palm strikes. On my count. 1. Ha. 2. Ha. 3. Ha. And so, class continued, with one little surprise addition to the group, who was more than thrilled to be there. A year later. It was another early morning over Konohagakure and the start of a new work period for the citizens of the great shinobi state. The majority of the people residing in the metropolitan and downtown areas of the village were all getting up to start the day, with the streets gradually starting to fill the higher the sun rose. But far out of the way of the large bustling crowds, dirt roads and heavy atmosphere of the hidden leaf, in the more peaceful and clear atmosphere of the forested areas surrounding the ninja community, one particular youngster was tending to his own business. As usual, Naruto Uzumaki had once again dedicated the waking hours of his morning to training and honing his skills, polishing his skills in a way that only the most disciplined and driven of prodigies would. After having powered through an incredibly tense morning of cardio and strength-based training for this particular day, Naruto was now finishing his day with a heavy meditation session under a waterfall. Having found this secluded lake in the woods quite some time ago, the now 7-year-old youngster had been coming here frequently to practice some other more intense methods of training. This was evidence from how damaged some of the nearby trees were, which looked as though they'd been shredded by the child driving punches and kicks into them, with several more sporting what looked like bullet holes embedded in their trunks. However, the main focus for Naruto's presence here was to practice chakra control and manipulation, which he'd recently been doing a lot more studying of during his visits to the library. With his classes at the academy gradually starting to steep more and more into the shinobi curriculum, the blonde was now aiming beyond that and getting into the real nitty-gritty aspects of the subject. Hell, Naruto already understood the basic fundamentals of chakra, nature transformations, and all its advanced forms. Now he was starting to put them into use. Unlike his fellow classmates and villagers though, the route he was taking on this was a lot different to what everybody normally followed. In his explorations of the library's oldest sections, Naruto came upon some new journal entries involving the strange taijutsu he was practicing, which required the use of some strange type of chakra. According to the monk that wrote this set of books, the energy system described was completely different from the normal chakra and circulatory charts studied at the academy, and it was something the blonde was now devoting all of his sessions towards accomplishing. At this stage, his control was minute, but it was present. As the child sat there, underneath the heavy downpour of water beating down on his head and shoulders, Naruto kept his eyes shut and his hands lanced together in his lap. Sporting only a pair of tight shorts, the warrior in training was in a state of complete and utter concentration, as he was not only being forced to endure the cold of the current crashing down on top of him, but also work on stirring the energy inside of him, which still seemed like an entirely foreign and untamable force. That was until, after about half an hour of sitting there, The child's tense expression then relaxed, which was shortly followed by the rock he was sitting on beginning to shake as what looked like heatwaves started to waft off of him. Seconds later, as the peculiar anomaly gradually became stronger with each passing second, the little pebbles and debris sitting amongst the rocks sitting around Naruto lost all weight to them and lifted into the air, while the water slamming into the boy from above suddenly started to get pushed back by an invisible force. This unusual atmospheric disturbance was comparatively small and didn't really amount to much, except for a 2-foot break in the waterfall above the blonde that for a brief period kept him from getting wet. However, it was exactly the kind of reaction that Naruto was hoping to achieve and, upon reaching his moment of clarity, held it for as long as he could. Controlling his breathing and keeping his heartbeat steady, the blonde then reached out with his hand and suspended it in front of him. Upon which he focused the ethereal chakra into his palm, causing the end of his limb to start shimmering with the same steamy effect that had previously enveloped his entire body. After several moments, Naruto opened his eyes and finished his display with a sharp yell, which led to him firing off a blast of wind from his palm that cut through the air for a few feet. Seeing the leaves in the distant tree become disturbed from the tiny shockwave he produced, the youngster grinned triumphantly, only to then give a grunt of surprise when the waterfall that he'd been holding back slammed down on top of him, cutting off his great moment. Right, the child mumbled under the force of the torrential downpour, but then smiled seconds later when he realized it wasn't that much of a bother. I guess, I'll just call this a day then, Datbeo. Standing up and stepping down from his rock, the youngster then walked out from under the falls and jumped back to shore. Once there he returned to the clothes and scrolls he had folded up nearby, dried himself off, and got himself redressed for the day ahead. With the end of one season came the start of a brand new one, and Naruto had most certainly begun his with earnest. Having moved back into his apartment a couple months ago after an extended and incredibly harsh chapter of his training, the orphan was back to living somewhat of a healthier lifestyle. Having experienced a whole other side of the village and gotten a taste of hardship by way of unfairness in the class system, he could walk away feeling even more motivated to pursue his dreams and fulfill his goals. Normally such an experience would have made a person more jaded. But instead what Naruto received was a genuine wake-up call. It made him stronger both inside and out, and he now felt that whatever decisions he now made moving into his future would have a lot more weight to them. Of course, this was all mostly feeling at this stage, as the youngster wasn't able to make such a sophisticated breakdown of his training. So right now he was ready for the next step. After yet another day at the academy in which Naruto didn't really receive much in terms of learning or support as he'd already long passed the current level of the curriculum, the child then headed to the Hyuga compound for another class session with Fujiko. Having progressed quite far in their special brand of taijutsu, the boy was given a chance to work with the more advanced and well-trained students to focus on their exchanges and techniques. After a vigorous round of practice and spars, the students were dismissed and Naruto was sent home with some very positive feedback from the instructor. Needless to say, the blonde was starting to like the tough Hyuga woman with the scar on her cheek. She was spunky and cool, two traits that he greatly admired in other people. Now back in a normal set of clothing, which consisted of an orange and white hooded vest over a black t-shirt and a pair of orange shorts, the blonde youngster was now on his way to the academy. Wandering down the street by his lonesome and ignoring the people passing him by, the child then stopped by a convenience store to pick up some breakfast and lunch. When he re-emerged with a plastic bag in hand and a bun in his mouth, the child then turned down the road and headed for home. The moment he did so, however, Naruto suddenly spotted a familiar group of people crossing the junction just a few yards ahead of him. The sight of the gang prompted Naruto to stop in his tracks and narrow his eyes, as he quickly recognized one of the 5 children to be none other than Kato Uchiha, dressed in a gray high-collar shirt and white shorts, along with Hiko, Yochin, and 2 of his other mates. All of them were walking shoulder to shoulder, laughing, and chatting excitedly with each other, making a big show of themselves in public and looking like they were having the time of their lives. They were so caught up in their outing that the group didn't even notice the blonde in the hoodie standing further down the intersecting road. When they passed the crossroads and disappeared around the corner moments later, the stationary Naruto remained where he was and considered them for several moments. He chewed on the pork bun piece in his mouth and swallowed it. At the same time his brain ran over all the memories of every single encounter he'd had with their gang. At that moment, the child was given 3 options. 1. Turn around, walk away, and forget he even saw them. 2. Go back to one of his designated training areas and take his frustrations out on a tree. Or 3. Chase them down and beat them up for all the hell they'd put him through. Remembering the pain and torment Kato and his crew had inflicted upon him over the years, and how their actions had further managed to ostracize him from the rest of the village and the children at the academy, a surge of energy suddenly rushed through the orphan's body. It gripped at Naruto's chest, causing his hands to clench and his gaze to darken. Upon which a malicious grin then crossed his lips. I feel like eating something different tonight, the boy chirped to himself as his eyes flashed dangerously. Maybe I'll go for a hunt, Dadbao. Decision made, Naruto quickly finished the bun he was holding, crouched low to the ground, and leapt high into the air. Springboarding off of a nearby balcony, the youngster made it to the rooftop of the adjacent building with ease, where he then proceeded to follow the group from a distance. He was bored and stressed. He needed to take